Have you ever stopped and wondered why, say, the way your local city council works feels so completely different from how maybe an international aid agency operates? Or even how things are run in different countries? It's more than just different policies, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It goes much deeper. It's wrapped up in history, in culture, in all these societal norms that shape things in ways we don't always consciously see.
Right. And that underlying difference, that complexity, is really what we're digging into today.
Exactly. We're taking a deep dive into comparative public administration, or CPA. Sounds a bit academic, I know, but stick with us.
Yeah, don't let the name fool you. It's basically a crucial lens, like a special pair of glasses, that helps us make sense of all these administrative systems, the ones that really shape our world. It shows us the surprising similarities, the stark differences, and crucially, why they work the way they do.
And our mission for you today is to cut through that complexity. We want to give you the essential toolkit, the key ideas for understanding how these systems are studied and why that understanding is, well, so critical today.
Think of it as your shortcut to getting genuinely clued up on global governance without, drowning in jargon or feeling totally overwhelmed.
Precisely. And we've pulled together a great stack of sources for this, research papers, articles, really insightful analyses looking at how CPA evolved, its main theories, the challenges it faces now. We've done the sifting for you.
We've extracted the good stuff, ready to jump in.
Let's do it. So first things first, what is comparative public administration? At its heart, it's the study of public administration systems, how governments and public bodies work, but always comparatively.
Meaning not just looking at one system on its own.
Exactly. You put them side by side. It's about comparison to really understand what makes each one tick, what's unique, what's shared.
And it's not just comparing country A to country B, right? It's more complex, more multidimensional.
Absolutely. It's cross-cutting. You can do cross-institutional comparisons, maybe looking at, say, the tax collection departments in two different states within the same country, like India, to see why they might operate differently despite being under the same national framework.
Okay, so comparing similar bodies within a nation. Then there's the more obvious one, cross-national, comparing systems between different countries.
That's the classic one, yes. Like comparing maybe the British police system with the Indian police system. You look at how history, law, culture have shaped them differently.
Makes sense. But you mentioned culture. It goes beyond just national borders then.
Definitely. That brings us to cross-cultural comparisons. This can mean looking at systems in nations that share some broad cultural background, maybe administrative approaches to women's issues in India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, all South Asian nations, but with distinct setups.
Okay.
Or you can compare across vastly different cultures. Think about comparing how social justice is administered in, say, India versus Ukraine versus Saudi Arabia. Hugely different contexts, culturally, economically, politically. It forces you to see how deeply culture shapes administration.
Wow. Yeah, so you can't just assume an administrative fix from one place will work somewhere else without understanding that cultural layer.
Yeah.
And there's one more, cross-temporal, comparing across time.
Exactly, like looking at how district administration worked in India before independence versus how it works after. It lets you track evolution, see what changed, what stayed the same, and why. It's this multi-layered approach, comparing institutions, nations, cultures, time periods, even comparing within nations and cultures, that gives CPA its power.
So it covers the structure, the processes, how officials behave, their roles, and the impact. Basically, the whole picture. And the goal is always to find those similarities and differences, and crucially, the reasons behind them, the why.
That's the core objective, getting to the root causes, understanding the dynamics, not just describing, but explaining.
Okay, so where did this idea come from? Does comparing administrations go way back, like ancient Greece, Aristotle?
Well, yes and no. Aristotle famously compared different Greek city-state political systems. He was definitely thinking comparatively about governance structures.
But not the administrative nuts and bolts.
Not really, not in the way we think of it now. When people did talk about administration in other places, it was often pretty vague, just descriptive, not much deep comparison or analysis of how things actually worked day to day. Fred Riggs later called it just studying the government of foreign countries, not really comparative government.
Right, just listing facts rather than analyzing patterns.
Yeah.
So what were the big problems with those early studies, say, before World War II?
Well, a major one was how narrow they were. They mostly just looked at a few big powers, the US, Britain, France, Germany, maybe the Soviet Union, Italy, very Western-centric.
So a tiny slice of the world's administrative reality. And were they analytical? Did they dig into why things worked or didn't work?
Not much, mostly descriptive, just outlining the formal government institutions. Very little analysis, explanation, or even focus on problems. They'd tell you what the structure was, but not how well it worked or why it was structured that way.
And critically, you mentioned they ignored the environment.
Yes, a huge blind spot. They almost completely failed to account for how government systems interact with their surroundings, the society, the economy, the culture. That whole ecological perspective we'll talk about later, it was basically missing.
Which seems crazy now, knowing how much context matters. What about non-Western systems? Were they even considered?
Barely. Before WWII, remember, many places we now think of as developing nations were colonies. So there was very little interest from Western scholars in studying their administrative systems comparatively. The assumption was often that the colonizer system was the benchmark, the one to emulate.
So the conditions weren't really right for a truly global comparison.
Yeah.
But there were sparks, right? Early hints of comparative thinking. Woodrow Wilson in the U.S.?
Yes. Wilson's 1887 article, The Study of Administration, is a key moment. He actually suggested the U.S. could learn administrative efficiency from Europe, particularly the Germany, without necessarily copying their political systems. That was a definite comparative impulse.
Interesting. Taking the admin lessons without the monarchy.
Exactly. And then later, L.D. White, in his 1926 textbook, the first real public administration textbook, tried to lay out universal principles he hoped would apply everywhere, from Russia to Iraq to the U.S. Ambitious, maybe flawed, but definitely thinking comparatively.
So the seeds were there. But the real catalyst, the big bang for CPA, was after World War II. What happened then?
Several things converged powerfully. First, the war experience itself. Many Western scholars, especially Americans, ended up working in administrative roles in non-Western countries during or right after the war.
So they saw it firsthand, on the ground.
Exactly. Direct, practical experience. And they saw massive differences in how administration worked, how people behaved within those systems. They started realizing these differences weren't random. They were tied to very different socioeconomic and cultural contexts. Places like the Philippines or post-war Japan were eye-opening case studies.
That must have really challenged the old one-size-fits-all view.
Completely. Then second, you had the rise of international technical assistance programs. Think about the UN being formed in 1945, the Marshall Plan rebuilding Europe. This led to huge amounts of aid and technical help flowing to poorer non-Western nations.
And academics got involved in that.
Heavily. U.S. scholars particularly were involved in designing and implementing these programs, often recommending administrative reforms. Paul Appleby's reports on India's administration are a famous example. This practical engagement really fueled interest in understanding the administrative systems of these countries they were trying to help.
So the real-world need to rebuild and develop created a demand for this kind of knowledge. And I guess these developing nations themselves desperately needed administrative reforms.
Absolutely. They were building nations, often from scratch after independence. They launched major reform studies, bringing in both local scholars and foreign experts. This generated a ton of information about different systems. And as they looked for solutions, they naturally started borrowing ideas from developed nations, which required cross-cultural and cross-national analysis. It was a very dynamic period.
A feedback loop, almost. Reforms lead to study, study informs reforms, and the sheer number of newly independent developing nations must have fundamentally changed the game.
Fundamentally, post-war decolonization created dozens of new countries in Asia and Africa. They faced huge challenges building economies, societies, political systems. They needed strong administrative capacity and policy, planning, finance, everything.
Massive undertaking.
Huge. And you had universities, big private foundations like the Ford Foundation, pouring resources into supporting technical assistance, training, sending experts. All this activity massively boosted CPA studies because suddenly there was this whole new world of administrative systems to understand and engage with.
It makes total sense. The practical needs just drove the academic interest. And wasn't there a parallel movement in comparative politics happening around the same time?
Yes, very much so. Comparative politics also boomed post-WWII, trying to understand these new nations, the Cold War context. And as scholars studied political systems, they naturally had to look at the administrative systems, too. You can't really separate them. People like Joseph Lapalambra, Fred Riggs, Farrell Hetty, Dwight Waldo, key figures, were often working across both fields, sharing ideas, methods. It was a really fertile intellectual environment.
And all this energy, these different streams, kind of culminated in the Comparative Administration Group, or CAG. That sounds like a major turning point.
It was the pivotal organization. formed in 1960 under the American Society for Public Administration, ASPA, and crucially funded by the Ford Foundation from 63 to 70, with Fred Riggs as chairman. CAG became the powerhouse of CPA.
What do they actually do?
They ran influential seminars, published a huge number of monographs and books, over 100 sponsored research all over the world, in Asia, Europe, Latin America, Africa. They really put CPA on the map as a serious, distinct field of study.
And they started the main journal, right? The Journal of Comparative Administration.
Yes, which later became Administration and Society, still a top journal today. They really built the foundations, the key concepts, the research agenda, the community of scholars, people like Riggs, Brabantio, Esmond, Hetty, Siffin, Waldo. They were the pioneers shaping the field in that era.
Gave it real momentum and legitimacy.
Absolutely. Though it's important to note, when the Ford Foundation money ran out around 1970, CAG struggled and eventually disbanded in 1973. That external funding was critical.
So it faced challenges. Did the field just fade away then?
Not entirely. Its functions and, importantly, its spirit were picked up by a successor group within ASPA, formed in 1973, the Section on International and Comparative Administration, or SICA.
Okay, so a continuation, an evolution.
Exactly. SICA kept the focus going. They promote study, teaching, research. They give out the annual Fred W. Riggs Award. So despite the institutional dangers, the core interest in comparative administration adapted and survived. It's fascinating how practical world events really drove this academic field forward.
It really is. Okay, so we know what CPA is, how it grew, its wide scope. Let's dig into why it's actually so important. What's the real significance of studying administration comparatively?
Well, its significance is huge, really. First off, it provides the foundation for a more scientific study of public administration. Robert Dahl said it way back in 1947, you can't have a real science of administration without comparison. James Coleman put it even more bluntly. You cannot be scientific if you are not comparative.
Strong words. So comparison is key to finding patterns, testing ideas across different settings.
Exactly. It helps us move beyond just describing one system, allows us to generate insights, test hypotheses about what works and why, and build broader generalizations, moving us closer to real understanding.
And it doesn't just draw on administrative theory, right? It pulls from other fields, too.
Absolutely. That's the second point. It's interdisciplinary enrichment. CPA borrows heavily concepts, methods from political science, sociology, economics, anthropology, psychology. This cross-fertilization makes the study of public administration much richer, broader, and more robust. It brings in diverse perspectives.
Which logically leads to a stronger ecological orientation, right? That idea that administration isn't in a vacuum.
Precisely. Traditional public admin often implicitly assumed a Western context. CPA, especially contemporary CPA, really champions an ecological approach. It forces us to look at that dynamic two-way interaction between the administrative system and its environment, social, cultural, economic. It makes the analysis so much more realistic.
And by doing that, it challenges narrow parochial views. The idea that our way is the only way.
Exactly. It's a powerful antidote to parochialism. CPA exposed the biases in early Western-centric studies by highlighting the very different realities in the non-Western world. And that didn't just change how we see non-Western systems, it actually forced a rethink of Western administrative analysis, too. Showed everyone there's always more to learn.
And it has very practical uses, like informing foreign assistance.
Definitely. Understanding the specific administrative context, the cultural nuances, the real capacity on the ground, insights from comparative studies help international aid agencies and donors make much smarter decisions about where and how to provide assistance. It helps avoid imposing solutions that just won't work in a particular environment.
Makes aid more effective, hopefully. This also sounds like it encourages a more systemic approach, seeing the whole picture.
It does. Drawing from systems theory and other social sciences, CPA encourages us to see administration not as isolated departments or rules, but as an interconnected system, constantly interacting with its environment. You see the ripple effects, the feedback loops.
And it connects directly to administrative development, improving how administration actually works.
Yes. By focusing on improving structures, processes, behaviors, CPA emphasizes how better administration is crucial for speeding up socioeconomic and political development. It's about building that institutional capacity.
Which led to the whole concept of development administration.
Exactly. That concept emerged directly from CPA's focus on the role of administration in newly independent nations. Development administration is all about goal-oriented, change-focused administration designed specifically to drive national progress. It's a major legacy of CPA.
And seeing how others reform their systems can inspire administrative reforms elsewhere.
Precisely. Learning about reform experiences, successes, and failures in Britain, Indonesia, Sweden, India, wherever inspires change globally. International organizations like the UNDP and World Bank actively promote governance reforms, drawing heavily on these comparative lessons.
How does it help make administration more responsive to citizens?
Well, the systems and ecological approaches inherently emphasize inputs from the environment, what citizens demand, what support they offer. This makes the whole system potentially more people-centric because it's designed, ideally, to respond to those inputs. It pushes towards greater administrative responsiveness and rationality, aligning services with actual needs.
And you mentioned a big shift in analytical approaches away from just looking at structures.
Yes, that was crucial. Early on, a purely structural approach might have just labeled non-Western systems less developed because their organizational charts look different from Western ones. CPA helped shift towards a structural functional approach.
Meaning
It recognized that different structures, even multifunctional ones common in developing countries, could still perform the essential functions of administration effectively. It was a move away from judging based on form towards understanding function and competence within diverse contexts. It respected administrative diversity.
Okay, so CPA really offers a richer, more realistic, and practically useful way to understand governance worldwide. What about its current status? When CAG disbanded, SICA took over. But where does the field stand today? Are there challenges?
Well, the institutional journey had its bumps, as we said. The dissolution of CAG in '73 was a blow, no doubt, largely due to the loss of that core Ford Foundation funding. But SICA stepped in, keeping the flame alive within ASPA.
But there was that critique from Gołębiewski about a self-imposed failure experience. What was that about?
Right. Gołębiewski argued, quite perceptively, I think, that CPA perhaps set itself an unattainable goal in its early, very ambitious phase. It was searching for the grand universal theory of public administration that would apply everywhere. Given the sheer diversity of global administration, maybe that single overarching theory was just too much to ask for.
So aiming too high initially?
Yeah.
But it didn't disappear. What's happening now?
No, it's definitely active. In terms of ongoing initiatives, CPA is taught widely in universities across the world at undergrad and postgrad levels. Most public administration journals feature comparative articles regularly, and SICA continues to actively foster research, networking, and teaching.
So it's embedded in academia. Any particular challenges still?
One challenge, perhaps, is that while there's global interest, there's still maybe a relative lack of comparative studies and deep theoretical work originating from scholars within developing countries, analyzing their own and regional contexts comparatively. That's an area with huge potential for growth.
That's interesting, the need for more voices from the Global South in shaping the comparative agenda itself. What are the hot topics, the current focus areas within CPA today? What are people researching?
It's really tuned into contemporary issues. There's a lot of work on the impact of neoliberalism, comparing privatization trends, public sector disinvestment across countries, huge focus on citizen centricity, looking at things like citizen charters, comparing their effectiveness globally and making services more responsive.
Makes sense, given the push for better service delivery everywhere. What else?
Decentralized governance is big, comparing local government reforms, citizen participation, social audits. Also, human rights issues, comparing protection mechanisms. The rise of third-party governance, how globalization is shifting roles away from traditional bureaucracy towards networks involving NGOs and private actors, the privatization movement more broadly, and the role of the private sector. And the networking approach to welfare, looking at how voluntary organizations contribute to empowerment and service delivery.
Those really mirror the big shifts in governance we see globally. So, looking ahead, what are the future prospects? Is CPA set for a comeback, a revival?
I think the prospects are incredibly strong, actually. The evolving global reality itself almost demands it. Think about the complex geopolitics, the rise of Asia, ongoing conflicts, trade tensions. All these create fascinating, urgent questions for comparative administrative analysis. How do different state systems cope, adapt, respond?
And the interconnectedness, globalization, supply chains.
Exactly. That increasing economic interdependence, driven by globalization, digital technology, complex supply chains, it all creates new needs and opportunities for comparing how different national administrative systems support or hinder economic performance.
Yeah.
Even the countertrend, deglobalization and protectionism, provides rich comparative ground. How do systems react to those pressures?
And those massive global issues that don't respect borders, climate change, pandemics, terrorism.
Absolutely critical. These issues require comparative understanding to find workable, sustainable solutions.
Yep.
You can't tackle climate change or international terrorism with purely national approaches. You need to compare strategies, learn from each other, coordinate administrative responses.
Like India's push for a global terrorism convention that's inherently comparative.
Precisely. And then there's the trend towards collaborative governance or co-production, where public agencies, private companies, NGOs, community groups all work together. This blurring of lines necessitates comparative analysis to figure out what models of partnership actually work best in different contexts.
So as governance gets more networked and complex, the need for comparison just grows. Robert Fried's quote you mentioned really sums up the excitement, doesn't it?
It does, perfectly. He spoke of the international interdependency of bureaucracies, the universalizing of demands for human rights, the crucial role of publics, the different experiences of nations, all presenting unexpected challenges, unexpected opportunities for research, and unexpected excitement.
It frames the complexity not as a problem, but as an opportunity for deeper understanding.
Exactly. So the overall outlook, very favorable. The world's complexities are practically crying out for more and better comparative public administration. It feels like a field whose time has truly come, or perhaps returned with renewed vigor.
Okay, this is fascinating. We've seen the breadth and importance of CPA. Now let's really zero in on arguably its most influential figure, Fred W. Riggs. We need to unpack his ecological approach and those famous models.
Absolutely. Fred Riggs, 1917 to 2008. A political scientist by training, but just a towering figure in CPA. His work, like The Ecology of Public Administration from 61, and especially Administration in Developing Countries, Theory of Prismatic Society from 64, fundamentally shaped the field. He really pushed it beyond just description.
And he didn't just look at administration in isolation. He wove together different theoretical threads, right?
Yes, he was brilliant at synthesis. He drew on general systems theory, how parts interact. He used the structural functional approach, what tasks different structures perform. But his most distinctive contribution, the one he's most known for, is his development and application of the ecological approach to CPA.
The ecological approach. Let's
Yeah.
break that down. When we say ecology here, we're not talking about rainforests and ecosystems in the environmental science sense, are we?
Not directly, but the metaphor is key.
Mhm.
In CPA, ecology means the study of the mutual reciprocal relationship between an administrative system and its environment, its social, economic, cultural, political context. It's about that constant interaction, the give and take.
So administration shapes its environment, and the environment shapes administration.
Exactly. It's a dynamic interplay. Now, others like John Gauss and Robert Dahl had hinted at this ecological perspective earlier, but Riggs truly championed it, made it central to comparative study. His lectures in India, published as The Ecology of Public Administration, were really pivotal in emphasizing this.
And his core argument was that you simply cannot understand administrative differences, especially between Western and non-Western countries, without looking at this environment.
Precisely. He argued strongly that the similarities and differences only make sense when you examine the environment, the dynamic relationship between it and the administrative system. He famously said in 62 that CPA was moving from being non-ecological to being ecological. It was a paradigm shift away from those earlier context-blind studies.
Okay, so what's the underlying logic? What are the key premises of this ecological approach?
Well, first, the administrative system is seen as a subsystem, deeply embedded within and influenced by the broader political system, the executive, legislature, courts, parties, pressure groups, the whole political landscape.
And it's not just politics, but the wider environmental context, too.
Absolutely. It's shaped by the economic system, the social structure, like class or caste, dominant cultural values, demographics, technology, even things like mass psychology or historical memory. All these factors form the environment.
And crucially, it's a two-way street. The admin system influences the environment back.
Yes, that reciprocal influence is key. The administration isn't just passively shaped, it actively affects the economy, society, culture, etc. through its policies and actions. It's this constant dynamic relationship, this interplay, that produces the diverse administrative characteristics we see around the world. You need the ecological lens to really grasp it.
It sounds incredibly powerful conceptually. What are the main advantages, the merits of looking at things this way?
Well, first, it's just logically compelling. It grounds administrative study in the concrete reality of different contexts. Second, it's inherently geared towards explaining diversity. It gives you the tools to understand why systems differ, not just that they differ. Third, it's very practical for guiding reforms. If you understand the ecological context, you know that a reform needs support from the political system, maybe changes in economic incentives or alignment with cultural norms to actually succeed. You can't just drop it in.
Context is everything for reform.
Exactly. It also promotes cultural awareness, helping us understand why, say, corruption might be defined or practiced differently in various settings based on cultural norms about obligation or relationships. It was also key for development administration, helping figure out how administrative changes could drive broader societal development. Its overall impact on CPA was profound. It's now basically impossible to study comparative administration without considering the ecological dimension.
It seems fundamental. But are there downsides, limitations to the ecological approach?
Yes, primarily practical ones for researchers. It's often very difficult to measure or quantify the precise impact of these broad environmental factors, like culture or social structure, on administrative performance, or vice versa. This creates an operationalization challenge. It can be hard to translate these rich theoretical concepts into specific, measurable variables for empirical research.
So powerful conceptually, but tricky to pin down scientifically in some ways. Okay, this leads us nicely into Riggs' actual models, which were built on this ecological thinking, the Agraria and Industria models.
Right. These came first in his 1957 article. He was influenced by thinkers like Dwight Waldo and Max Weber, using what Weber called an ideal-type methodology.
Meaning these are pure conceptual models, not perfect descriptions of any single real place.
Exactly. They're theoretical extremes, built by exaggerating certain characteristics to create clear analytical contrasts. Agraria was based loosely on imperial China, Industria on the modern U.S.
So what defines the Agraria model, the traditional society type?
Key features include status based on birth or connections, ascription, not merit. Administration rooted in tradition, often favoring certain groups, particularism. Structures tend to be multifunctional, meaning one official or body does many different things. Social groups are rigid with low mobility, low occupational specialization, and a fixed social hierarchy.
Okay, very traditional hierarchical, not much specialization. And the Industria model, the modern type.
It's the opposite. Emphasis on applying rules equally to everyone, universalism, highly specialized structures for specific tasks, advancement based on merit and achievement, high social and occupational mobility, well-defined professions with their own norms, a class system based on achievement, not fixed hierarchy, and specialized achievement-oriented associations. The admin system here is the classic bureaucracy.
Two clear, contrasting poles. But these models had limitations, right? They weren't the final word for Riggs.
No, definitely not. Their biggest weakness was they were inadequate for understanding transitional societies, the many countries, especially post-WWII, that were somewhere between traditional agraria and modern industria. Riggs had a vague middle category, transitia, but it wasn't well developed. These models didn't really capture the messy reality of societies where old and new ways coexisted.
Too black and white, basically. Couldn't handle the shades of gray in the real world.
Pretty much. They also arguably had a development bias, implying a single path from agraria to industria, reflecting a Western viewpoint. They were also quite abstract, making them hard to use for concrete empirical research.
And maybe not enough focus on the administrative system itself.
That too. They focused more on the broad societal characteristics. And critically, while they considered the environment, they were maybe more environmental than truly ecological. They stressed how the environment shaped administration, but less on how administration shaped the environment back.
Okay, those limitations make it clear why he needed something more nuanced. Which brings us to his more famous typology. Feesed, prismatic, diffracted.
Precisely. This was his attempt to create a more sophisticated framework, especially to understand those complex transitional societies.
So this revised typology classified societies based on their levels of differentiation, specialization, and integration coordination, right? And he avoided terms like developed or developing.
Correct on both counts. He wanted more precise analytical categories. So let's start with the fused society. This is one end of his new spectrum.
Similar to agraria, the traditional end.
Very similar. Low differentiation, low specialization. Structures are highly multifunctional. Status is based on birth or tradition, ascription. Treatment is based on group affiliation, particularism. Very low mobility, rigid structures, highly traditional.
Okay. And the other end, the diffracted society.
This is like Industria. High differentiation, high specialization of structures and functions. Crucially, also high integration. The specialized parts work together well. Treatment is equal for all, universalism. Status based on merit, achievement. High mobility. This is the modern specialized society, and its administrative system is the bureau.
So fused is low differentiation. Diffracted is high differentiation and high integration, which leaves the middle ground, the really interesting one, the prismatic society.
Yes, the prismatic. This is Riggs's key concept for understanding those transitional societies, the ones in between fused and diffracted. It captures their mixed, often contradictory nature.
Oh, so what are its characteristics?
Well, instead of pure universalism or particularism, you get selectivism. Rules might formally apply to everyone, but in practice, certain groups get preferential treatment based on connections or status. Instead of pure ascription or achievement, you have attainment. Advancement depends on a mix of merit and factors like family, loyalty, or political ties.
A blend of merit and who you know.
Exactly. And instead of multifunctionalism, fused, or high specialization, diffracted, you have polyfunctionalism. Structures are more specialized than in a fused society, but less so than in a diffracted one, leading to overlaps and ambiguity.
So it's this intermediate blended state. This leads to the prismatic cella model, focusing specifically on the administration in this kind of society. Why the prism analogy?
Riggs borrowed it from physics. Think of white light, fused, undifferentiated, entering a prism. Inside the prism, it starts to refract, to separate into colors, but it's still mixed, unstable. That's the prismatic state. When it emerges fully separated into distinct colors, highly differentiated and integrated, that's the diffracted state. The prismatic stage is that messy transitional phase of partial differentiation.
Great visual. And Salah, what's that?
Salah is the term Riggs used for the administrative system within the prismatic society. It's Spanish for room or office, but he uses it to denote this specific type of administrative system, reflecting the characteristics of its prismatic environment. The focus here is really on understanding the Sala.
Okay, let's dive into the features of the prismatic society and its Sala administration. First up, heterogeneity.
This means a high degree of diversity, mixture, and often clashing elements coexisting. Old and new ways, traditional and modern attitudes, formal rules and informal practices all exist side by side. Think modern cityscapes next to traditional villages, high-tech industries alongside cottage crafts, formal banks, and informal moneylenders. It's a society of contrasts.
Sounds potentially chaotic or at least complex. This probably leads to formalism, the gap between what's written down and what actually happens.
Exactly. Formalism is a huge characteristic. There's a wide gap between the formal laws, rules, and procedures on paper and the actual practices on the ground. Laws might promise equality, but implementation often favors the connected. Reforms are announced with fanfare, but often remain superficial because the underlying informal practices don't change. It's the difference between the official version and the reality.
Where theory and practice diverge significantly. And then there's overlapping.
Yes. This means that new, modern administrative structures often exist alongside older, traditional structures, like family, clan, religious groups, which continue to influence how things actually get done. Formal roles overlap with informal power networks. A single function might officially belong to one agency, but in reality, several different groups, political parties, influential families, business lobbies are involved in shaping or blocking its execution.
And this overlapping affects different aspects of the prismatic Sala system, like the political system. Riggs called it a bureaucratic polity.
Right. He observed that in prismatic societies, there's often an imbalance. Sometimes bureaucrats, due to their expertise and control of information, gain excessive informal power control beyond their formal authority, leading to a bureaucratic polity where the administration might dominate policy, possibly ineffectively, or conversely, politicians might exert excessive partisan control, party-run polity, also undermining rational administration. The ideal balanced polity is often missing. There's a struggle between formal authority and real control.
An unstable power dynamic. What about the economic system? The bazaar canteen model.
This is a vivid metaphor for how economic interactions, especially with the state, often work. The bazaar aspect refers to price indeterminacy. Official fees or prices for government services might exist, but the actual price you pay can depend on bargaining, connections, or bribes like haggling in a bazaar. The canteen aspect refers to how insiders or privileged groups often get access to services or benefits at subsidized rates, like cheap meals in an exclusive canteen, while outsiders pay more or get less. It captures corruption and unequal access.
A very telling image. And the social system, polycommunalism, or collects.
Here, Riggs noted the presence of distinct, often competing communal groups based on ethnicity, religion, region, etc., which he termed collects. These groups often operate with hostility or rivalry, each trying to capture the administrative apparatus, the Sala, to benefit its own members. When one collect dominates, the Sala tends to dispense favors and resources primarily to that group, creating resentment and undermining administrative neutrality and effectiveness.
So the administration becomes a tool of group competition. And culturally, polynormativism or normlessness.
This describes a situation where multiple, often conflicting sets of norms exist simultaneously. Society might formally espouse modern, universal norms, like meritocracy and partiality, but people's actual behavior, including officials, is often guided by traditional, particularistic norms, like loyalty to family, kin, or community. Officials might apply different standards to different people depending on their connections or status, leading to a sense of normlessness, a lack of consistent, predictable standards.
A clash of values playing out in administration. And finally, the direct impact on the administrative system. Nepotism.
Yes, this is almost a summary characteristic. Favoritism based on family, kinship, friendship, loyalty is widespread. Recruitment, promotion, service delivery, all heavily influenced by personal connections despite formal rules about merit and impartiality. Informal networks and behaviors often dominate, leading to goal displacement. The administration serves private or group interests rather than its official public goals.
That's a comprehensive and quite critical picture. What's the overall takeaway from the prismatic Sala model? Is it universally applicable?
Well, crucially, it's an ideal type. No single developing country perfectly matches every feature. The degree of prismatism varies hugely. And, importantly, even highly diffracted developed countries can show prismatic features sometimes, especially in certain sectors or during crises. It's a tool for analysis, not a rigid category.
And what are the main criticisms leveled against Riggs's models in general?
Some argue he focuses too much on the negative or dysfunctional aspects, potentially overlooking the positive roles bureaucracies do play in development, even in difficult circumstances. Critics felt he didn't fully explain how the Sala could contribute to positive change. Others felt he overemphasized the environment's influence almost to the point of determinism, downplaying the agency of the administrative system itself. And again, the challenge of operationalizing these complex concepts for empirical research remained. Some even argue formalism could sometimes be positive officials bending rules compassionately.
Interesting counterpoint. So to quickly compare, bureaucracy versus Sala. What are the key contrasts?
Weber's ideal bureaucracy. Highly organized hierarchy, defined competence, selection by achievement, rule-based administration, universal and personal operations, strict separation of public-private. Riggs's Sala. Heterogeneity, overlapping functions, selection by attainment, merit plus connections, formalism, rules bent ignored, personalized norms, widespread corruption, nepotism. They represent vastly different administrative realities.
A stark contrast indeed. It really highlights why context is so vital.
Absolutely. Despite criticisms, Riggs's models, especially the prismatic Sala, provided invaluable language and frameworks for understanding the complex realities of administration in much of the world, powerfully applying that ecological lens.
What a deep dive that was. We've really traced the journey of comparative public administration from its early, vague beginnings to becoming this essential field. We've grasped the power of the ecological approach, seeing administration and its environment in that constant dance.
And really getting into Fred Riggs's work, particularly that prismatic Sala model, it just gives you such a richer vocabulary for understanding why administration looks and feels so different in societies undergoing major transitions. It moves us way beyond simple labels.
So why does this all matter to you listening right now? Well, in a world facing huge shared challenges, climate, health, economy, understanding how different governments and public organizations actually work and why they work that way is just fundamental.
It really is. This isn't just academic. It helps you look past the headlines, analyze governance more critically across different cultures, and see that complex interplay between policy, the way things are actually done, and the people involved. It's a framework for making sense of it all.
It helps cut through the noise, gives you a lens to understand the diverse administrative realities out there. So as we finish up, here's something to think about.
In our world today, so interconnected that also often fragmented, where the lines between global and local, formal rules and informal ways of doing things get blurry. How much of the prismatic, that mix of old and new, formal and informal, might still exist even within our own supposedly diffracted modern societies?
And what does that mean for the ongoing quest for governance that's truly effective, truly responsive, truly fair? Anywhere in the world, something to chew on until our next deep dive.